Hey everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking. Hey everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hello, Rush Nation, and welcome to the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast. As usual, I am your host at the FSA Tweets on Twitter, or you can call me Liam. And as normal, I have my co-host, the one and only at Dynasty Island on Twitter, Rich. How are you doing, mate?
Yeah, very good. Back after a week off. I think it was the first 5 Yard Dynasty pod I've not been a part of, so it was quite weird listening in the week, I'll be honest. But yeah, it was nice to spend a week watching all sorts of random sports and yeah, enjoying the north of England. So I can't complain.
The Midlands. We are literally in the Midlands, Rich. I'm not gonna
North.
stand for that.
I go out of my house. I drive north. Therefore, it's the north.
Anyway, before we get into a north-south debate, let's bring our fabulous guest on. He is known as the Stack King, the Trey Lance Truther, the Mark Andrews Truther. I mean, we could probably make a list. MVS Stan. He is at NFL_T-Strack. That is T-Strack with an R in it. Tom, how are you doing, mate? It's been a whole year since we've had you on.
Yeah, it's good, man. It's great to be back on with you guys. Always enjoy chatting with you, whether we're sat in a bar at the UK FFC or whether we're on stream. It's always a pleasure to be chatting with you too.
So you've changed up your setting. Last time you were in some sort of garden, sipping on a beer. You, as Rich said before the show, you seem to have a different setting each time.
That's it. I'm slowly going up in the world, but I'm not quite at the place where I've got myself a nice podcast room yet. So one of these days I'll be back on and I'll just have the full, bookshelf behind me with oversized memorabilia, but not today. Sat in the kitchen.
You say you're not going up in the world, but you're going over to New York with Underdog Fantasy, which is a Bestball site over in the US that isn't available in the UK, but they've invited you exclusively over. I mean, if that's not going up in the world, Tom, I don't think anyone has aspirations anymore. Yeah,
well, it's a good lesson in just being nice. As they said, they appreciate the support I've given their site over the last couple of years and wanted to repay the favor by letting me fly out there on their dime and do some drafts with them. So very much looking forward to it. Warming up, stretching and getting limber ready for 4 days of intense drafting.
Incredibly well deserved, and very excited to hear back and hear about what actually drafting on the underdog platform is like, Tom.
So for those listeners that don't know Tom, he is the Stack King. He releases stack charts every month, every time he can get his hands on ADP data, basically. He is the best ball guard. When I first started doing best ball, Tom had me in his DMs asking questions like, what's this roster look like? And I can guarantee you, Tom, I didn't do very well last season. I made a bit of profit, but didn't do very well. But Tom is here to share his best ball knowledge. So he writes over at FantasyPros. Apparently you're doing a lot of redraft at the moment, but you're trying to bring best ball into it. And that's where Rich had the idea of, let's try and bring best ball into Dynasty and see how we can learn. So we had Joe on for redraft strategies, and we're going to bring you in to talk about those best ball strategies in Dynasty. So Tom, I'm going to start off with roster construction. It seems like the most fitting place to start. So I'm just basically going to leave the floor open to you and let you take it away with roster construction within your Dynasty teams. Is there a specific way that you prefer to build your roster, and is that based on your best ball preferences?
Well, I think just expanding that slightly for a second, it's like, in dynasty leagues, we're also consumed about the individual player a lot of the time. And it's very much like, I want this player because he's done X, Y, Z in college and he can do X, Y, Z in the NFL. Whereas in best ball, if you're drafting a lot of teams, or if you're drafting more than, say, 10 teams, it becomes a lot more about how do I want my overall portfolio or collection of drafts to look. And the moment you start doing that, you can open yourself up to more strategies. If you're somebody who does one draft a year, then go out there and draft the best players as you see it, draft however you like, and make sure that you're having the most fun with it. But if you're going to spend hour after hour in front of a draft board, then not only are you going to be drawn to more precise strategies, but you're also going to probably be a bit more anal about wanting to do everything you can to win. And in best ball tournaments in general, I think like about 65% of the field typically don't stick to any known micro strategy. They tend to take a balanced approach. So say if you've got 20 roster spots, that means 3 quarterbacks, 7 wide receivers, 7 running backs, and 3 tight ends, something similar to that. And it's just not a successful way to win. It doesn't mean it's not going to win, but by honing in on strategies such as zero running back, hero running back, or like those kind of, then there's lots of subsections of that, avoiding the running back dead zone, you can really enhance your team's ability to win. Like Rotoviz have done a lot of work on taking 2 quarterbacks before, say, round 12 and stuff like that, and showing that it's a very successful strategy. And again, you can expand that to what Antonio was talking about a couple of weeks ago about winning the flex position. So best ball, typically there's a lot more written about roster construction strategy than in Dynasty, because like I was saying, so much of it goes back to player takes in Dynasty. But when I'm drafting a Dynasty team or a Dynasty best ball team, or even a redraft team, I want to stick kind of more similar to some of the principles that have been researched so heavily within best ball, because Dynasty leagues, it's always a little bit difficult to find too much research on what can win and what can't win, because so many of our leagues are so incredibly different. I mean, I'm in multiple leagues with you guys, and it's very rare that any of those are very similar in format. Like they might have more flex positions, they might have different scoring settings. And so it's very difficult to look at an individual league and go, this is the way to win this league by going hero running back. But in these best ball tournaments, I mean, some of these tournaments now have up to 1 million people in them. So at the end of it, you're left with an awful lot of data where you can see, statistically speaking, teams who've done this tend to do a little bit better. So I try to apply that thinking a lot of the time whenever I'm drafting. And more often than not, that involves either going with a hero running back, which involves taking 1 running back within the first 2 rounds, and then typically avoiding the position for a few rounds, or hero running back, or zero running back, which means basically avoiding the position for the first 6 or 7 rounds. And obviously that changes if you're talking super flex, because quarterbacks push ADPs around. But the main thing that I do when I apply that to Dynasty is try hard to avoid the kind of players that would normally in a best ball draft be in areas of a draft that I wouldn't want to draft. And the easiest example is the running back dead zone. In a typical redraft or best ball league, that's normally between rounds 3 to 6, 3 to 7. And even though in a Dynasty league, when you're looking at the ADP, a lot of the time there might be a mix, because you might have promising young rookies falling into that section. It's the characters that would normally populate the dead zone that I want to avoid. So Josh Jacobs, David Montgomery, they're not anyone I'm ever going to draft on a Dynasty league, no matter how far they fall, because they fit the kind of archetype of the player that I know from best ball doesn't lead to good win rates.
So do you think that, I guess, best ball is a unique beast in that, as you said, you can have quite structure in terms of how you draft it. Dynasty, yes, you can approach your draft in a certain way, but as soon as you're off, you can be in a Dynasty league for 2-3 years and your roster doesn't replicate anything like what it started with when you drafted it. Do you think there's any lessons that perhaps we could take from that roster construction in terms of best ball, of trying to stack the correct amount of positions on a bench, and how we would then turn that into kind of a Dynasty
Yeah, I think
format,
that's a great point, Rich. I think it's like, so let's say if I'm starting a draft in 0 running back and I've got 20 roster spots, I won't take my first running back till probably by around round 7. And by the time I get to about round 10, 11, I've probably got 6 wide receivers, an elite quarterback, and an elite tight end. But then it very much becomes, I need to pack out the rest of this. I need to get to about 7 running backs or so. And it doesn't really matter, that they're all going to be a little bit iffy, but it's like that quantity over quality at that point. And so in a dynasty league, that's exactly it. If I've started with 3 running backs at the top end of my draft, there's no way that by the time I get to round 10, 11, I should still be spending more and more draft capital on running backs because I've made my bed. I've already said that these 3 running backs need to perform, and in dynasty, they need to perform soon. So why am I taking all these ones later on when I need to build a win now roster probably, and I need to be taking other players who can complement that?
So you're trying to kind of balance, if you go wide receiver heavy early, your bench will be loaded with more running backs typically, and kind of vice versa.
Exactly that. And I know that's something that you kind of like, you tend to stack up a lot of running backs later. And it's, whereas again, if I've taken elite wide receivers earlier, you definitely kind of find that zone where there's teardrops. And instead, that feels like the place where I want to be stacking up on running back 2s, running back 3s. And, I don't need 5 or 6 Sterling Shepard type players on my bench because...
Man, I hate Sterling Shepard. Hey, he's got a special place in my heart, Sterling Shepard.
I love Sterling Shepard. And when he's fit and healthy and all that, he's great. But I'm sure if we looked at like points per game over his career, there'd be an awful lot of games which weren't very useful to fantasy. There'd be an awful lot that were, but it's very easy to fall into that sort of habit of going, oh, okay, I'll pick up that guy who gets the ball often. And before you know it, you've got 4 or 5 slot receivers who are going to get 4 catches for 40 yards every week. And it stops you taking a 0, but it doesn't win you anything those weeks.
Yeah. Liam, what about you? Are you, when you're building out your bench, shall we say, which I think is kind of where we're perhaps leaning with this, are you just looking to acquire the best player available, regardless of position, the player you perhaps view as the most valuable? Or are you viewing it, like Tom was saying, in a specific kind of positional breakdown to try and balance out the rest of your roster?
I suppose it's a bit of both, and you're going to hate this because I am on the fence a little bit with this strategy, but I have to have enough players of each position. So I do have those kind of positional requirements in my head. So, for example, I prefer elite tight end or basically no tight end. And if I go down the no tight end route, which is more often than not, I will have a lot more tight ends on my bench because I need the flexibility of basically streaming within Dynasty, which is not something that people typically think of. So in my head, if I don't take one of the top 5, top 6 tight ends, then I will think as we go further into the draft and maybe not reach, but maybe think, okay, I need a tight end here rather than going what I would consider as best player available. Now, that does come full circle around to quarterback, for example, or even the running back or wide receiver position. If you are attacking wide receiver early, as Tom said, people tend to maybe pick up those slot receivers to fill out benches, whereas I, like yourself, like both of you actually, prefer to kind of stock my bench full of running backs. Now, the caveat to this is I don't really know how to put it. I tend to lean more to running backs than I do wide receivers when it comes to bench spots because of all the basically talking with you, Rich, for the past 18 months, near enough. And the amount of data that goes into it that shows a running back is going to have more of a boom when there comes to an injury than a wide receiver in most cases, because there's only typically 1, maybe 2 running backs that get that extra workload when it comes to an injury, whereas a wide receiver, there are 3, maybe even 4 positions available on the field, depending on what set they what they play on the field. So when it comes to my bench spots, yes, I will have the positional limits, I suppose, in my head to an extent, but it doesn't control the way that I draft. If there's a wide receiver that falls and I'm trying to stick to, say, 5-6 wide receivers in my bench, but there's one falling, I'll just take the wide receiver. It's not like it's set in stone, in my opinion.
I think that's something which even in best ball and sometimes gets a little muddied with any of these kind of micro strategies. Best player available when they, picking up value is always going to be a good thing, even if, that means you're 2 or 3 picks into a draft and you're committed to a 0 RB build, but then all of a sudden a round 2 running back falls to round 4. Taking that doesn't mean that you need to stray away from the rest of the mindset. And again, this, it can apply to Dynasty, that just because a player falls doesn't mean you need to change your whole strategy. It's just going, right, well, I'm going to take that value because now I've been presented with an opportunity where I can create an even stronger roster than I should have been. But I'm still going to adhere to the mindset that I don't want to overload at one position and make the rest of my roster weaker because of it.
Yeah, and I think for me, when we're talking about benches in Dynasty, I kind of split my bench in half. So the way I view my teams, and it's something that I think I've talked about a couple of times, is I sort of have my starting lineup, and then I have basically one backup for each position. So I'll have in a Superflex league, I'll have my QB3, my RB3, my wide receiver like 4 or 5, my tight end 2 perhaps, and then maybe one flex. And I view that as kind of my starting roster, if that makes sense. So I've got cover. If I'm in a league where perhaps my running backs aren't as strong, maybe I'll add an extra running back into what I view as kind of my starting roster. And then the rest of my bench is what I'm basically viewing as those end of bench spots. And that's where I'm basically trying to target players that I think could potentially boom in value and return on the investment I've made in them. And generally speaking, those are what I class as volume-based positions. So that's running backs and quarterbacks that I think that if there is an injury, they then can either be a spot starter for me, or I can flip them for an asset because somebody else needs a running back or a quarterback. And, I hear Tom talk quite regularly about those spike weeks. And in best ball, it's all about the wide receivers, because wide receivers have more spike weeks than running backs or quarterbacks or whatever. But actually in Dynasty, those, wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 types that, KJ Hamler, for example, he could have 3 or 4 great weeks for best ball this season. But from a Dynasty perspective, you're probably never going to feel comfortable putting him in your lineup unless, something horrific happens to Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, and he's the wide receiver 1 all of a sudden. So that tends to be why I lean away from those wide receivers, because I just think that they become roster cloggers, essentially, which is what I'm always trying to avoid on those kind of end of bench spots.
And I think that's something which you can apply to best ball, to redraft. It's whenever you're selecting a player, it's saying, okay, what's happening on my starting lineup if this player is being successful? Am I drafting this player? So like KJ Hamler, if you're drafting KJ Hamler in Dynasty, is it because you're just hoping to get an increased value and you can move him on? Or is it because you truly believe that he can be a starter in a roster? But if that's the case, what does it say for the rest of your team? Are you suddenly going to be saying, okay, well, that means he's outperforming somebody that I've spent X amount of draft capital on in a draft, and now am I going to be presented with lineup problems week to week where I'm going to have to choose, or I'm just going to have to move him on before his value dips? So, yeah, I think it's always good to kind of think about not only what that player's path to success is, but also what it means for the starting lineup players that you have as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So, Tom, we've spoken a lot about roster there. And one thing that, as I said, you're the stat king. One thing that kind of comes into roster construction would be stacking. And for those that don't know, it tends to be you're stacking a quarterback with one of the skill positions, if not multiple. So when there is a pass to whoever for a touchdown, you're essentially near enough doubling your points, or you're maximizing the points from one play. So is that something that you bring into Dynasty, and do you bring it into Dynasty heavily, or is it just something that's kind of like a cherry on top of the pick?
Yeah, I feel like we've probably talked about it a little before. I don't feel like in Dynasty or Dynasty Best Ball, it's not as essential. Like the Best Ball competitions that have gotten so big now, like the DraftKings one, for example, there's almost 900 people in the final. So you really have to think about, okay, I've got one team against 899 other opponents. How does my team stand out from that? How do I win? And that's where stacking becomes more similar to DFS, where you really need those team stacks and the players on the other side of the games sometimes to be able to really amplify your score. But in Dynasty, it just isn't that far along. And again, going back to what I was saying, it's kind of hard to quantify it because nobody is really writing up all 10 Dynasty leagues that we do every year and going, all right, well, the win rate in this one was because this person had a stack and that. But I think in terms of the most content that's been done even about it, Mike Leone of Established a Run, who's really brilliant guy and incredibly smart, wrote an article last year called Deep Dive Stacking in Season-Long Fantasy. And in that, he kind of broke down an awful lot more about like just taking player win rates and stuff like that and taking usable weeks and working out what the actual score in differences would be with stacks. And it's really, whenever you select a QB in a draft, you're already making a bet that you're hoping at least that they can outperform their ADP, and you're hoping that they're going to be successful. Otherwise, there's not much point choosing them. And the moment that you're saying, all right, well, I believe this quarterback is going to be good enough to get me X amount of points every week, you're making a slight bet on the pass catchers around them, unless they plan on running the ball 60 times a game, which is very unlikely. Then you are saying, okay, well, I want that quarterback. He's going to do well at times, and I want a piece of that offense, because you're not just, it's not just the quarterback. You are betting on the whole team. And you can look back to like 2019, and it's one of the more extreme examples, but the Ravens that year, and I go with the Ravens being a Raven fan because I know the ADPs were low, but Lamar Jackson was drafted as the QB 14 that year, and he finished as the QB 1. Mark Andrews was drafted as a tight end 15, finished as a tight end 5. Marquise Brown was drafted as the wide receiver 64 and finished as the wide receiver 45. And I know those are end of season points sort of finishes, which makes some people twitchy, but it's like, it shows that all those players, the top players in that offense, they all outperformed their ADP because the quarterback had such an incredible season that year. He dragged pass catchers along with him. So in Dynasty, for me, it's I want to stack on every single roster that I've got. It's something that I firmly believe in. I've seen enough data around small increases to your win rates and stuff like that. So for me, the kind of stacks that I target, I've got one roster where I've got Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow, and I don't see any reason why I'd want to break that up for years unless the Bengals do something stupid. And anytime that you can tie a young quarterback and a young wide receiver or an elite wide receiver to them on a dynasty stack, that's great. But the kind of thing, like, I'm not rushing out to pick up Tyler Boyd because the spike weeks that Jamar Chase is capable of, him and Joe Burrow can combine for 50 plus points easily. But the weeks where Joe Burrow and Tyler Boyd score well, you're probably talking 35 points combined. And meanwhile, somebody else has Jamar Chase and has picked up 20 points. And it's like, you're not really seeing the main benefits of it. So, I mean, don't get me wrong. If somebody offered me Tyler Boyd at the right price, or if in a draft he was there at his ADP or beyond his ADP, I will take him going as a tiebreaker. That's not a bad little bump to have. But it's about sort of tiering your expectations and saying, okay, in this situation, Jamar Chase has gone, a couple of picks before me. Do I trade back out because I'm upset that I didn't get a stack? Or you just go, all right, great. Well, I'll just take the next elite wide receiver and move on. It's fine.
Yeah, I think that The difference perhaps between Dynasty, Bestball, Redraft, whatever, I think, as you said, there's so much data out there now saying that stacks work in whether it be a normal 12-team redraft league, whether it be, these massive charity leagues that we're all in or these Bestball tournaments. The difference is that in those leagues, everybody's starting from pretty much the same spot, aren't they? And that everybody's, in a draft, everybody's got a first-round pick, a second-round pick, a third-round pick as such. In Dynasty, it's different because, if you're an established Dynasty league, every person in the team is starting from a completely different spot because, they're 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old rosters that have gone through that gradual transition. And I think that for me, stacking in Dynasty, I think is a useful tool. But I think the key thing is, and it's something that I know Tom has preached from day one, I'm not giving up basically any value in order to chase a stack. And I think that if I can organically fall into a stack, and it's pretty much any stack, I'm happy with that. And I think that it's good for my Dynasty team because essentially I want good players on good offenses. And, if that comes in with a stack, then great. I'm not going to go out of my way and give up value to chase a negative stack because, if I've got, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Jahan Dotson and Carson Wentz, chances are I might have that stack, but chances are if I'm in a Superflex league, I hope that I'm not starting Carson Wentz every week.
So let me ask you this, and both of you. If you had a very heavily win now team, would you say you've got Joe Burrow on there? Would you ever envisage yourself trying to acquire Jamar Chase coming off, say, CD Lamrich or someone like that to grab the stack and go, right, well, this year I'm going to bet on if they have another year like last year, then that should take me over the top and I could win. Would you be okay giving up the value in that situation?
Absolutely. If I think the trade is of good enough value, then I would absolutely do that. I'm in a 10-team Devi league, for example, last year. I was champ 2 years ago. I was heading into the playoffs. Thank you. I was heading into the playoffs potentially as favourite. I can't remember the exact trade, but it was something involving CD Lamb, and I had Josh Allen, and I basically traded CD Lamb to get Stephon Diggs. And I already had Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers. So it was basically, I was viewing it now as I was a repeat champ. I'm in a win now roster. I'm almost viewing it slightly as a redraft mindset. I want that extra stack. And I can't remember what the exact trade was off. I was probably giving up a little bit of value to make that trade to go and get that stack. And I think I'm all for stacks, but I think that, if I'm 2-3 years away, first of all, I'd question anyone that's 2-3 years away because I'm all in. I'm all in on you should never be rebuilding more than 12 months in Dynasty. But I think that chasing stacks for the sake of it can sometimes come back to bite you. And I think, look, if you're going to get two good pieces that are joined together on a good offense, fantastic. But I'd question giving up value unless that situation, as you said, Tom, where you're in a win now situation and you're almost in that redraft mindset.
Tom, are you going out? So when we talk about losing value in terms of trade, I suppose, are you specifically going out to people with players that you could stack with, say, your starting quarterback and attempting a trade purely for that reason? So say you, I don't know a player that you don't like, but for example, you have a player that you don't like that stacks with your quarterback. Does that help you trade for that player, or are you still sticking by your essentially assessment or evaluation, prediction, however you want to say it, and not trading for them outside of value because of what you think is going to happen?
I think it, and it's kind of that fence moment of saying, well, it depends on your roster. But for me,
join me.
Like, I tend to be very quite fluid with my kind of player ratings and evaluations when it comes to a lot of stuff. So for me, if somebody's offering me a trade specifically to stack, quite often I feel like, because I've got this reputation as somebody who likes to stack, I feel like the value's not always there. But it's always about trying to be a little sneaky and being like, right, well, I'd like this player to kind of like bump up that stack. Can I package together 2 or 3 players into a deal and just acquire them where it's like a little more subtly? Because if I make it obvious that I want that player to complete a stack, people will have your pants down.
I think that's a good rule in all of Dynasty, isn't it? Let's be honest. I think whenever you're working on any sort of trade, I think if you're going in and making it very obvious exactly what you want, chances are you're probably having to overpay to acquire that asset, because as soon as the person realizes, right, he's only interested in this for this reason, I'm gonna up the price 10-20%. Whereas if I talk about it quite a bit in our Patreon, Tom, where I'm talking about you go in perhaps talking about a player that you're not that interested in, and then trying to pivot the conversation. Oh, okay, well, what about this guy? So that the person doesn't realize who your necessary initial target is. I think it's a good mindset to try and get that good value, rather than just going and saying, right, I've got Joe Burrow, I want Jamar Chase to complete my stack. What's the price? And then you end up paying 3 odds.
At the moment, this is just a wider Dynasty thing. The moment you ever say, what's the price? You're never going to be happy with the answer. Well, rarely going to be happy with the answer, because if someone says, what's the price to me for Jamar Chase? I'll tell you 5 firsts.
How big's your checkbook? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've got a perfect example of that actually happened last night into today. I mean, it's slightly different in terms of I was interested in both guys that I was inquiring about, but in a Dynasty league, just standard 12-team Superflex tight end premium, I went in for Barkley and Clyde Edwards-Helaire because I needed a second running back, and I feel like I'm a contender. I've got so many wide receivers that I can't start them all. And it's not even to the point, Rich, where you have backups. I've got backups to the backups. That point.
Humble brag.
I mean, I'm still a little bit away in that league, but I went in for Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Barkley, and I kept talking about Barkley, and it's obvious that he doesn't want to move from Barkley now. But then with all these offers that I was sending him, trying to get Barkley and CEH, he just sent me one and said, I'm not going to move Barkley, but here's one for CEH. And it was just for Claypool straight up. And I mean, I'm not going to flame him or anything, but I looked, as soon as I saw that, I took it because I'm not high on Claypool. I've been trying to get rid of him in that league for a while. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that I'm high on Clyde. But that just goes back to don't go straight in for the player that you want, because even though I did want both of them, I ended up coming out with the one that maybe I wasn't necessarily as needy for, but because I talked so much about Barkley and literally the whole conversation was about Barkley, I ended up coming out with CEH for a very fair price, in my opinion.
I think what you're saying there, Liam, as well, kind of it rings a bell for kind of Bestball and Redraft drafting. It's going, okay, well, my roster needs another running back, but then it's not going, right, well, I'm not going to reach 20-point positions to get this because I can wait. And if that player goes, I can take this. And it's not being as glued to it, is it? It's saying, all right. And so many more trade discussions that I have that are successful start with going, hey, I'm looking for running back depth, or I'm looking for a starting running back, and taking it from there, because those conversations just typically tend to develop better than just sending a trade offer of, I'd like this player.
I mean, this has gone down a little bit of a side, like a little bit of a segment here, but the way that I started that whole conversation was I'm interested in Barkley. And instead of going, what's your price? I was like, what are you looking to do with your roster? Because I've got a bunch of wide receivers. You look thin, but if you don't think you're thin at wide receiver, then there's no point in me offering you one. So I went in with how can I kind of help you? And then I built a trade based off that. And we're going down a trade segment here, but if you go in, as you said, with what's your price, the price is always going to be way too much. And it's kind of trying to show that you're not there to take advantage. You're trying to make your team better, in your opinion, but also make their team better. It's kind of like I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine.
And I think that flows nicely perhaps into our third segment, which is about not necessarily winning each individual pick within a draft, but trying to kind of win the draft as a whole, Tom. And I think that, that what you were saying basically ties that up perfectly, doesn't it? Is that you need to view it not as a draft of 20 individual picks, but a draft of one complete piece as such, and an all-round piece of work.
Very much so. I mean, you guys know me. I'm trying to acquire an awful lot of Trey Lance in drafts this season, and it can be very easy, no matter how many drafts you do, to feel like when a player gets sniped one pick in front of you or two picks in front of you, it's rage boils up and you're just like, and then, but really it's like, these things are going to happen. And the more drafts you do, the more often it happens. And the more you just have to understand that it's like, okay, this one pick, it matters, but it doesn't really matter as much as making sure that the whole roster at the end of it is strong. And so whenever I'm drafting, it's try to take that slightly zoomed out view of going, I don't necessarily need my round 8 pick to be perfect every time, as long as a lot of picks have led me to, when I zoom out and see it, that I have a clear positional strength in one or two places. And if I compare those rosters to the other elite managers in the draft, it's very obvious that I have one of the strongest teams straight away. And you can go about that in lots of different ways, but it's like, Sean Siegel, who wrote the original Zero running back thesis, he used to talk about having 4 of the top 15 wide receivers in order to win these big competitions. And anytime that your flex is strong, going back to what Antonio was talking about a few weeks ago, it always just bumps up the roster a lot. So quite often you'll find people who are perhaps less experienced tend to draft to fill out the starting lineup first. It's like, right, okay, I've got my 2 running backs and I'll get a wide receiver and a quarterback. And it's okay to start filling your bench up, because quite often by the time that everybody's teams, the drafts are done, it's the teams who've started filling their bench up earlier who really stand out as strong teams. And for me, I want that strength to be in wide receivers, typically, particularly in Dynasty. And I want really strong options at QB 1 and 2. I'm not so worried about 3. I can make up for that in bulk. But it's like any time that you quarterback 2, if you leave it, you tempt fate and you're just like, well, I'll push it another round. And then all of a sudden you've got Carson Wentz and Mac Jones as your QB 2 and 3. And it's like, okay, well, that might work. And then all of a sudden, you're in a situation where you're like praying for an injury, so one of your backup guys can be a serviceable QB3. Yeah, it's fine, but it's like if you've got the 2 elite options, like I've got one Dynasty roster with Lamar and Josh Allen on, and I'm never not going to be happy when I look at that roster, and that came from the draft. So yeah, it's just taking that slight global view and going, okay, this might be a bad pick, but as long as I can just even it out across the course of a draft, then I know that come game day, I'm probably going to be quite happy.
And I think that comes back to, we've talked a few times, Liam, I think, about value over everything, basically, when you're drafting. And I think that whilst Tom's talking about specific best ball strategies and going in with a specific target of I'm taking running backs here, I'm taking wide receivers here, I think in Dynasty, you can take a bit from that. But I do think that because of the ability to trade and the ability to move pieces around, I think that if you can take a slightly more value-led approach, you can kind of get yourself in a better position, and you're not desperately going, right, I need to get my RB2 because I've only got one running back. And actually you can say, right, the best player available here is clearly a wide receiver. I've already got 6 on my roster. I'm going to take my wide receiver 7 rather than my running back 2, because I think in 6 months' time, if I need a running back, I can probably trade that wide receiver 7 for a better running back than is available in the draft at that point.
I mean, we as you said, you've spoken about it, or we've spoken about it a lot on the pod as value over everything. And that means so many different things to so many different people. I mean, value to one person on a player is different to another, and that's what makes all of fantasy football so enjoyable, because everyone has different values on players. And that's why Tom was so happy last year with Mark Andrews absolutely bombing out when people weren't talking about him as highly as Tom was. But that key difference is where you can take advantage in drafts. And even though we tell you not, or that this whole bit was, you don't have to win every pick, but that's how you can feel like you win every pick, by drafting people at the value that you're comfortable with. But yeah, going back to what Tom was saying, you don't even have to win every pick, because if your roster in overall turns out that you hit on a bunch of guys that are later drafted, then you're onto a winner, aren't you?
I mean, Rotoviz have done work on this, looking at like about, you know, how ADP, it might not be perfect, and it, you know, quite often there are definite things to be had, but on a whole, it's quite well adjusted to the market. And by order, not, you know, some teams, you know, you'll see them, they'll auto draft and come out quite all right. I mean, my home league, the first year it was running, was won by a guy who auto drafted, and, you know, he just ended up with all the players that slipped past ADP or right about. And obviously I'm not advocating that people go out and auto draft, but by picking up those people who slip past ADP, picking up the bargains, as well as like being conscious of your roster construction, I don't think you're ever going to end up in a bad way when you look at your roster.
I think, look, ADP is groupthink, isn't it? And, you know, if there's enough people that are doing it, and enough people that are, you know, the degenerate people are the people that are drafting 30, 40, 50 times. They're the ones that are contributing far more to ADP than Joe Bloggs down the street, who rocks up with a 120 or 200, top 200 list and drafts once. He's not contributing to ADP anywhere near as much as the people that are doing it consistently. So I think that groupthink, you know, there's a lot of power in there. And I think that I agree with what you're saying, Tom. You know, sometimes we're too quick to throw away ADP and go, actually, this guy's being massively underdrafted or overdrafted or whatever. And actually, it tends to come back to, you know, yes, there are some issues with ADP, and depending on the site you use, there's always loopholes you can take and potential advantages to pick up through the draft. But generally speaking, groupthink is pretty solid, you know, 90% of the time.
So, Tom, that kind of brings us to the end of this, but instead of ending it there, we're going to put you on the spot a little bit and talk about some deep rookies or deep sleepers in general that you kind of like. I mean, you can take this however you want. You can take it from a best ball point of view, of like a boom bust, or however you want to take this. But have you got your eye on any guys, whether they're rookies, like standouts in camp, or and this isn't just an open mic, so you can talk about MVS in like round 20.
Round 20, those days were good. It's round 10 in best ball of a minute.
Really? Round 10?
Oh, wow. Okay, I mean, I'll give you a couple of players that I'm ending up with a lot. And I was kind of on the Josh Palmer hype train quite early on, or Joshua Palmer, depending on which platform you're on. But he was somebody that last year, when he came into the league, I always want pieces of good offenses. You know, it's like, and he had a very clear path to becoming the wide receiver 3 in Los Angeles for the Chargers. And it seems very likely that this year he's going to be really heavily involved as the wide receiver 3. So Josh Palmer's somebody I've really been very pleased that he seems to be getting a lot of hype behind him now. And then the other one's Isaiah McKenzie. He seemed like the way the Bills used him at the back end of last year, when teams go out of their way to script plays for people, and when they bring you back in on a new contract, regardless of bringing in Jamison Crowder, who I know you guys are higher on, and then to see all the Isaiah McKenzie hype, it's a beautiful thing to see. And even, it's one of those situations where I look at players like Josh Palmer and Isaiah McKenzie as, if I miss on them, it's a tiny miss, but the upside of those players is really big. But like, you can look at some of the other rookies, like Wan'Dale Robinson's somebody who I quite like as a player. I think, he's quite interesting, but I just don't believe that he's going to have any kind of road to big weeks ever. So he's somebody I've kind of stayed away from a little bit. But I'll definitely, those are the two kind of like sleeper picks that I've got for this year. In terms of rookies, I think it's probably more the running backs that I've been drawn to. I'm a known Josh Jacobs hater, so as Amir White, somebody I've ended up drafting an awful lot of.
Can I jump in and offer? Can I jump in and offer one of mine, Liam, that I'm quite excited by? So it's a guy that I think I was quite a bit higher than consensus in terms of rookie ranks. So Tyquan Thornton, I think a lot of people slated the Pats for the pick, and I think because of that, basically he fell far too far in terms of rookie drafts. I was scooping up at, sometimes it was ridiculous, like 4th, 5th round picks. Now, there's a lot of negatives coming out of the offense and Pat's camp at the moment. But the one thing I keep reading and I keep hearing is that Tyquan Thornton's having a fantastic camp. It's something Tom and I talked about offline the other day. Nelson Aguilar's contract, I wouldn't be shocked if he was cut. There's the Pats can save, I think, what did we say, Tom? It's like 4 or 5 million by moving on from Aguilar. 4 or 5 million, yeah. I think they'd take a bit of a dead cap, but it just seems like, and I was slow to it with Tyquan Thornton, and I was drafting a team with Colm Kelly, who does all the podcasts with Rotoviz, and he was like, look, got to take Tyquan Thornton in the 18th round or so. And I was just like, really? I don't really see it. And sure enough, yeah, then all the camp reports start coming out. And I think it was a lesson in one of those where it's like, okay, well, to me, it felt like the Patriots roster felt a little thick in that position. But then you kind of weigh it up and you go, actually, do the Patriots really want to pay Nelson Aguilar this huge contract when they can get out of it? And it was a lesson that I've learned that, perhaps Nelson Aguilar sticks around and balls out. But it was a good lesson in going, all right, sometimes you just got to dig a little deeper. And I know, Rich, that that's something you often do. Yeah, and I think it's one of those where you could look at it and say, well, Aguilar's got 10 million guaranteed on his contract this year. There's no way the Pats are letting him go. But actually, that saving of 4 or 5 million to move on from him, if Tyquan Thornton's going to be the guy that can be the deep threat immediately as a rookie, the Pats are the kind of team that would very quickly move on from a player that they view as surplus to requirements in order to save that cap hit, regardless of what they've spent already.
Sorry. I was just going to say, the other two players I seem to be drawn to quite a bit at the end of drafts, whether it's Dynasty or Bestball, is a couple of tight ends. So I don't know how Liam will feel about this, but Trey McBride and Greg Dulcich, like, they both seem to be players that perhaps not straight away, but have a path to being very fantasy viable in very fantasy friendly offenses. Like, give me them all day over the likes of Jelani Woods in Indianapolis, where, even though the roster isn't as deep with fantasy pass catchers, it just doesn't feel like an offense that's going to support a lot of fantasy pass catchers. Whereas in Denver and in Arizona, you can easily see a lot of players doing well.
Yeah, I love the Trey McBride shout because I think he's an elite prospect for me. I was very high on him as a prospect pre-draft, and he sort of has fallen out of love in a lot of dynasty circles because he sat behind Zach Ertz. And yes, I'm not quite sure exactly what the Cardinals are doing, shall we say, in terms of their approach with signing just anything, but particularly signing the all 2017 offense. But look, I think that Zach Ertz is an elite player against zone coverage, and I think he's still got that nuance, shall we say, to be able to get open. But against man coverage, if you look at the stats, and I was having a little nose through PFF and stuff, he's basically one of the worst tight ends in the league in terms of winning against man coverage. which, like that feels like quite an important thing for a tight end to be able to win against man coverage. So, yeah, I think that Trey McBride, there's definite buy window now. And I wouldn't be shocked if he was a massive buy this time next year.
Yeah, I mean, you can see, Greg Dulcich has apparently had a very good camp, whereas Trey McBride's had quite a quiet camp. It's been kind of hampered by the fact that Kyler Murray's had COVID. There's been little bits like that around it. So it's like the Cardinals camp's been very subdued, but I think there's very much a buy window now, whereas Greg Dulcich, his route to actually playing is Albert O might put up a little more competition than I think that Zach Ertz is going to put up long term. So yeah, out of the two, I've sent out a few offers this morning for Trey McBride. No, yet to hear back from it.
I mean, I'm going to jump in there because I've had to sit there quietly and not be able to talk and defend Jelani Woods, but that'll come in a minute, Tom. So on the Zach Ertz thing, yeah, his stats may not be great against man coverage, but last season he was the tight end 5 in season long scoring, tight end 8 in points per game. I mean, from a guy that is 31 turning 32 in season, that's not half bad. I don't foresee Trey McBride getting in front of him while Zach Ertz is still there. Looking at his contract, Zach Ertz has 2 years basically on his current deal. They can save in year 2, but it's only about 2.8 mil, so it's not a massive saving for someone that if he has another great season this season or even a pretty good season, they're not going to get rid of him for 2023. Moving into 2024, that's when they save about 8 million. So that could be the window, and everyone loves a third-year breakout tight end. So Trey McBride, I think that the window could be midway through this season when he's not getting as many looks as people kind of hope. But I still think that he's pretty cheap for what he could be in a few years' time. Going over to Greg Dulcich, I don't see it, unfortunately. As soon as he went to the Broncos, I was kind of out. I'm not a huge fan of Albert O, but at the same time, I just don't see it for that tight end group in general. Russ has never enjoyed throwing to his tight ends. He had Jimmy Graham and didn't use him whatsoever. I'm not saying that Jimmy Graham was in his prime.
Had the corpse of Jimmy Graham, and I think Jimmy Graham was still a top 12 tight end.
You proved me wrong on that, Rich, but I still don't believe in that tight end room in terms of there's so many pass catchers there that I just don't see a top tight end performance. And you know what I'm like, I'd rather take the random obscure guy that I think is going to jump up, and that's where I come down on Jelani Woods. I mean, that tight end room is arguably more open than the Broncos tight end room. There's questions at tight end, at quarterback going into the future, but Matt Ryan supported a top fantasy asset in terms of Austin Hooper a few years ago. I mean, he just led Kyle Pitts to a great season. I'm not saying Jelani Woods is Kyle Pitts before you jump down my throat, Rich, but what I'm saying is Jelani Woods is a top, as in athlete, for a tight end position. And I'm picking up that value completely. Now, he's not had a great camp, so we can't really include him in camp sleepers. But
I think that's something which we can open up a bit as well. It's like in Bestball, like the ADPs fluctuate so massively. So like Isaiah Pacquiao, who was getting completely undrafted last week, is now being drafted in like the 16th, 17th round. And in Dynasty, there's being active at this time of year, there's very quick buy and sell opportunities. And if you're just going on sleeper and putting a player on the trade block, you're not going to get any offers. You're not going to, I don't know what people would be willing to give up for Isaiah Pacquiao now, but like there's a good chance that
I was quoted 2 seconds today.
Exactly. So it's like, being realistic, but it's also that thing of gaining value, and it's a great time to be active, and it's something I have to push myself to do more of because I'm just very hyper focused on my best ball teams at the minute.
one guy that I've been drafting pretty late on in a lot of drafts, and this comes down to training camp buzz, is Eno Benjamin. I mean, Rich is already shaking his head now. I was pretty high on Darrell Williams when he signed with the Cardinals, and I put out a tweet at the start of training camp. I've been trying to stick to it as much as possible of don't fall for camp hype. Yes, take note, but don't seriously adjust rankings for it. So even though we've said all of this about all of these players, I don't know about you two, but I'm not adjusting my rankings down to camp hype, even if there's like a week's worth of hype around that player. Eno Benjamin is just someone that I see constantly over Twitter of he's working as the running back 2. He is behind James Conner, and there's not really much of a competition behind Darrell Williams. And yes, I could be falling for hype, and that's why I'm saying I'm taking him late as a sleeper, maybe shying away from Darrell Williams a bit when he's going 8+ rounds ahead of him. That's even if Eno Benjamin's getting drafted.
I feel like you could take that little segment there, Liam, and repeat it back in 2021 and 2020 and 2019. I feel like at this point every year someone has fallen in love with Eno Benjamin, and he's never done anything. I'm a massive Darrell Williams guy. I would say he dropped down 16 spots for me in my redraft rankings. So he went from running back 44 down to running back 60 for me today. So I am listening to the hype a little bit, but I'm not touching Eno Benjamin at all.
I mean, in that range, 16 spots there's not much splitting 16 spots.
Exactly. It's two tiers. It's 2 tiers. Yeah. Should we finish the podcast with Tom's Dynasty tip?
Yeah, I mean, this one which I'm a big believer in, and it's just not setting your teams on a Sunday by the rankings, the projected points scored on Sleeper, MFL, NFL, whatever you're playing on. It doesn't matter whether you're playing Dynasty or Redraft for this matter, but they are not the way to go. There's so many great resources out there, so many incredible people out there who put redraft rankings out week after week. Find somebody who you trust. And this is kind of my mindset with a lot of Dynasty and a lot of redraft content. It's about finding the people who you trust and whose opinion you value, and use their rankings against those predictions to set your team, saying, okay, well, this person's projecting this person to be X, Y, Z. Sleeper says that they could score this many. How do I feel about that? And come into a middle ground, and you'll do far better than if you just go in and go, oh, well, this person's going to score 12 points. I'll move them into my flex and take this really good player out because they're only projected 9 points. It's the way forward.
A big one on that. Sorry, Rich. A big one on that is rookies are always criminally underrated. I mean, Rich is high on Chris Olave right now, going into the season, and I've just looked in one of my PPR leagues, and he is projected like 7 points. Now, I'm not saying that Chris Olave is going to score and be absolutely monstrous every week, but I don't think a first-round rookie, the Saints with that believed in him that much that they traded multiple firsts to go and get him, is going to essentially
go 3 for 40.
3. Yeah, 3 for 40. And yeah.
Can I build off that? Because I think that's a fantastic point, Tom. I'm really pleased you made it. I think that what a lot of people do, and I've talked a couple of times about my process on a Sunday, and what a lot of people do is they're in multiple leagues. It gets to 5:30 perhaps on a Sunday, and they get stressed and overwhelmed in terms of their start-sit decisions, and so they just take the most obvious resource that's right in front of their face, and it is those sleeper or MFL projections, whatever you want. So what I think a really smart thing to do is sit down, work through your rosters when you have time. So for me, that is a Friday evening. I will, it's really sad, married man with kids sitting down on his Friday evening. But I will work through all of my rosters, and I will basically put in my obvious start sits. And if there are players that I perhaps have a question mark over, i.e. that is a decision between two players, it could be that a player is perhaps questionable. We don't know whether he's going to start on Sunday, so I want to get some more information. I will literally take a pen and paper and write it down so that then come Sunday, I've already know what leagues I'm setting. So there could be, 10 leagues where I know, right, I've got no questionable players. I've got no decisions. I don't even need to check those rosters. I know they're sorted. In this league, I've got a question mark between, do I start Cortland Sutton, who is questionable coming off an ankle injury, or Gabriel Davis, who's, in a windy condition, potentially a windy game up in Buffalo. And then I can know that I can just go and make that one decision. And it saves you so much time and so much stress, because rather than having to make 8 decisions or 10 decisions for each individual league you're in as to who to start, you're only having to make 5 or 6 decisions on a Sunday. Or you're only having to find out information about 5 or 6 players that are questionable, whether they're playing, whether they're not. And I think it just takes a lot of that stress out of the process on a Sunday, where you become overwhelmed and you, as Tom says, you just go, right, sleep projections, this guy's projecting more, I'm chucking him in my lineup.
But by the sounds of it, guys, that is all we have on the show. So that's all we have for you listeners. So we'll be back next week at 8 p.m. UK time, as usual, on a Tuesday. Go find Tom over at NFL_T-Strack. He works over at FantasyPros at the moment, and I can't remember your website off the top of my head. So, Tom, I'll pass it over to you to drop that in here before I sign off.
I mean, you can find me on Twitter, like you said, and then my website's nflbestball.co.uk, where I've got a link page which always links to wherever I've wrote content. It's always on there as like a kind of library of my work. And yeah, I'll have probably a little bit of news soon about where I'll be writing my DFS column for this season. And yeah, I say thanks for having me on the pod, guys. I always enjoy chatting with you guys.
Thanks for coming on. And until next week, guys, we'll see you then. Have a great week and stay safe.